Our oceans are one of our planet's most vital resources. Without their protection, entire ecosystems are at risk of collapse. The waters of Southeast Asia are among the most valuable, supporting the livelihoods and food security to millions. Each week, headlines continue to emerge that stress the danger that our seas are in. Chief among these threats is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. These practices can undermine sustainability efforts, distort data on fish caught, and can induce serious human rights abuses. How can we manage what we can't see? Seafood supply chains are complex and operate in some of the least connected areas. By increasing regional connectivity to document seafood's journey to our plates, we can not only detect and reduce illegal activities, but also generate data to help fisheries to be more sustainable. This benefits everyone. The USAID Oceans and Fisheries Partnership is working with the Southeast Asian Fisheries Development Center, as well as both government and private sector partners across Southeast Asia, to develop fully electronic traceability systems. These convert existing paper-based record-keeping with fully digital systems that trace along the supply chain and fill gaps where data is currently not being gathered. They connect each member of the seafood supply chain even in the most remote locations. Let's take a look. At sea, fishers enter catch and human welfare-related data via vessel monitoring technology that track the vessel's location. The information is transmitted to a central database that will be added to throughout the product's journey. Back on shore, the catch is met by buyers and brokers who enter key product information on a mobile application. The apps provide additional business and finance management tools, rewarding users by helping them to manage loans and track their earnings. Next, some seafood is immediately exported, leaving the port with all the data required to be smoothly imported to international markets. The seafood sent to processors is transformed into its final state, with data captured along the way. Finally, the seafood is shipped to local and international markets. Consumers are able to buy the seafood knowing that it's fully traceable, responsibly sourced, and that their purchase rewards legal and sustainable producers while keeping illegal products off the market. With electronic seafood traceability systems, we can better manage fisheries to reclaim our ocean's health and abundance, address human welfare concerns, and build stronger global marketplaces that support global prosperity and food security.
All right, we got a few seafood traceability people hanging out. So welcome to the last presentation at IFT Traceability Central for 2019. So we're gonna have Neil Eshelman, who's the Senior Program Officer for the World Wildlife Fund, and my counterpart in the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. So he's gonna be talking about solving the crisis in illegal and mislabeled seafood with global interoperability, which was perfectly set up by the prior presentation on blockchain. And one of the questions came out, what are the standards that are going to be used to integrate across the seafood supply chain? So without further ado, Neil Eshelman.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank IFT GFTC for Traceability Central. This has been a great opportunity for us to talk a lot about the global dialogue on seafood traceability. And so I'm excited to kind of share this topic. It's near and dear to me. So it can get a little bit heavy talking about illegal seafood and seafood fraud. So I thought I'd throw a picture up of my beautiful wife and dogs for a second. So you might be wondering why WWF is here, or maybe you've never heard of us. We are an environmental NGO that was founded in 1961. We operate in hundreds of, or about 100 offices across the globe, or 100 countries across the globe. And we focus on conservation issues related to the oceans, to forests, wildlife, climate, food, and freshwater. And we're often well known for our iconic black and white panda logo. So to answer that question, why is WWF here talking about seafood traceability? We have long supported the private sector and markets to transform the underlying causes of environmental degradation in many ecosystems and threats to biodiversity. And with those certifications that we have supported, we have pushed for chain of custody or traceability measures always to be a part of them. And we've also partnered directly with businesses to look at their supply chains and say, what is going on in the fisheries and farms that are underlying your supply of seafood, and how can we transition those to more sustainable sources? But often what happens is when we start asking these companies, where did your seafood come from? They point to a wholesaler and say, them? And they can't answer what that underlying fishery or farm is in those circumstances. And so we have been unable to target efforts a lot of times because that provenance of seafood is elusive. So that has led WWF to conclude that greater traceability is really needed to unleash data in order to combat seafood fraud and illegal fishing. So a lot of us can probably ask the question, are we getting what we pay for when we go to grocery stores, when we go to restaurants, and we purchase seafood? And the story a lot of times is no, unfortunately. Mislabeled and fraudulent seafood poses a risk for health and economics to the sellers as well as the consumers. And the bigger thing is that it can actually enable more nefarious activity than just the fraud itself. So I wanted to share a little bit of one of these cases. The quote that you're seeing here is for an affidavit for Carlos Codfather Raphael. It's a little bit of an interesting story to look up. Sometime just Google the Codfather and you'll see a number of articles. Carlos Raphael operated in the Northeast United States for many decades, and he owned quota and vessels that were targeting fish out of New England. What you see in here is that he skirted the rules for decades of the fishery management and the controls that were in place in order to to pose better economic gain. But what this led to is that it impaired a lot of the recovery of vulnerable species in the fisheries. And really what happened is that mislabeling and fraud is what masked the underlying illegal activity that was going on. So the seafood fraud that we can see going on in restaurants and in grocery stores can actually be a mark for something more detrimental to our overall ecosystems, threatening the long-term viability of fisheries and seafood overall. But what the Codfather was doing was not an isolated event. As you can kind of see here from this quote that's taken from a 2009 study, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or what is often otherwise known as IUU fishing, is a very substantial portion of the seafood trade globally. The numbers themselves are hard to quantify at times. It's shadowy behavior. So if you're trying to quantify the drug industry, the illegal drug industry, it's not a firm number at times. But the point that's evident is that there is a substantial amount of bad behavior that is going on that's undermining the management and undermining the compliant players in there. So the bad guys are plentiful. And so while the majority of the sector may be playing by the rules, in fact, a Rabobank study this year concluded that the global seafood trade represents about $150 billion in comparison to that approximately $24 billion from the previous slide. The playing field needs leveling. The compliant players need to make sure that they can distinguish themselves from the non-compliant players in this space. But we have this pressing need. Why hasn't the seafood industry and other bodies been able to take a giant leap forward or have an urgent response? And the real barrier has been the nature of the industry itself. It is an industry without coherence. It's extremely global. Seafood comes from almost every country on the planet and transverses to almost every other country on the planet. It's a highly diverse product group with thousands of species that are traded, and the species themselves are highly diverse. I like to think about oftentimes either sardines or even, it's eluding me at the moment, but very small planktonic fish that can be harvested, up to bluefin tuna that can be larger than some of the chairs that are on stage at this point. And finally, it's highly fragmented. There's a large number of small, medium, or tiny enterprises coupled with multinational corporations that have footprints on almost every continent on the globe. And this nature of high fragmentation and diversity of products and the global nature itself just makes it really challenging in order to come together. And so there's a desperate need for alignment in this industry in order to enable traceability. So as pressures from environmental NGOs like WWF, regulators, and the demand for transparency from consumers built up, the industry responded. Several actors had modest success by employing stovepipe systems that they were able to deploy as much as possible with their own market power with their select suppliers and customers. But there was the realization that an interoperable framework was really what was needed. Because of the decentralized, fragmented nature, there was a large interplay, and no one could choose one solution or just a handful of solutions that would apply for everyone's diverse operational experience. So a couple of years ago, IFT's Global Food Traceability Center plus some staff from WWF partnered to kick off an industry alignment process to accomplish this goal. And it was really modeled off of information that was listed in a research study published by GFTC. And you see this quote below about the inherent value of alignment and standards to make sure that traceability systems deliver value fundamentally. And so what is that process that came about? If you've been paying attention throughout Traceability Central, you've probably heard the global dialogue on seafood traceability come up. So this is a snapshot of some of the logos and names of members that are a part of this process. It's been operating for a little over 2 years, and it pulls together about around 60 companies from around the world, predominantly in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. But they represent every stage of the seafood supply chain. We have farms, we have fishers, we have the primary processors receiving the raw materials, we have the brands and importers themselves, along with the end of the supply chain involved with the food service distributors and the retailers themselves. And really, this is a business-to-business forum that happens to be facilitated by WWF and IFT's Global Food Traceability Center, but it's really the companies coming together to agree on what data is needed to accompany their products as it's traced through the supply chains, and how can that data be shared in a way that ensures that fidelity of the data and is interoperable and enables solution choice. And so momentum is picking up from this process. One great example is a recently announced partnership back in March. The Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship Partnership is a group of 10 of the largest seafood companies in the world by revenue and reach that recently endorsed the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability as a key initiative for delivering some of their commitments to ocean stewardship. And this momentum of building up with CBOS and our other efforts of more and more companies joining into the membership has powered a lot of work. Here you see a lot of great pictures from where we've been at work for a while. Some familiar faces from around Traceability Central you might notice in some of these pictures. But the work has consisted of having members meetings at trade shows and talking about the global dialogue. It's also included numerous webinars and like conference calls and surveys among the members to get into the heart of aligning on this data standard and figuring out where consensus and alignment can be derived. Earlier this year, we also hosted a seafood trackathon or hackathon in Bangkok, Thailand, where we presented a number of challenges to a series of developers from around the world And one of the great outputs that we like to highlight is a little app called Nemo, which is an open source tool, a chat bot for fishers to input their data on catch and output it into a data standard that's accessible for the rest of the supply chain. If you Google the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, you can find our website and our wiki where you can connect and see some of the winners from the hackathon. So I encourage you to check that out. But later this year, we are actually projecting to be able to release the guidance and potentially the data standard that's going to come from this group that represents that alignment. Now, don't hold us to it if we're not quite on there, but we're working very hard to meet that goal. So what is that alignment yielding? What is this taking shape to look like? What are we kind of producing? It really is around the concept of supply chain visibility. So there's a lot of elements to traceability. I really like who GFTC has been able to pull together here at Traceability Central. You see the importance of physical identification. You see the importance of the systems that are those data layers for individual companies. But fundamentally, you need that full chain visibility within the seafood industry to produce the results that seafood companies need to combat illegal fishing and seafood fraud in their supply chains. So that's why we have, as the membership of the Global Dialogue, have been exploring the GS1 EPCIS standard. GS1 is over there, and if you're not familiar with them, they are a standard-setting organization that works collaboratively with, establishes industry standard-setting processes. And one of those standards is the supply chain visibility standard called EPCIS. What we've been doing is exploring its utility for seafood, which has included defining critical tracking events. What are those key moments where product needs to be traced in the supply chain and what is going on in those instances, as well as what are those data fields that are important to seafood companies themselves and what needs to be captured and collected. And ultimately, when you have all of these CTEs and KDEs collected throughout the supply chain, it truly enables the full pedigree of seafood from harvest to plate to potentially be available if all actors are catching it, and really in an interoperable manner. And this visibility fundamentally reinforces the rule of law within these harvesting places. And so what you see happening is that by this industry aligning on this data standard and choosing to implement it among their individual systems, they're choosing an interoperable framework. And by doing so, they can unleash a radically improved data availability along their supply chains, which will fundamentally contrast the rule followers from the rule breakers and really make it possible for illegal fishing to be squashed out and to drastically mitigate seafood fraud in the supply chain. So this is an exciting initiative. The membership is no cost to join, and it's primarily open to companies who buy and sell seafood. Participation in our external stakeholder group called the Dialogue Advisory Group is open to academia, traceability solution providers, government, and any other interested parties that want to keep up to date on the work to this point. And registration is available easily through our website. So please check us out at traceability-dialogue.org. And thanks so much.
Do we have any questions from the audience? So in addition to EPCIS, what other standards are you using?
We are we're exploring a lot of the regulatory frameworks that are important for companies. So the Seafood Import Monitoring Program that's applying to U.S. importers of seafood. We're looking at the EU labeling standard, or the EU marketing rules for seafood companies, as well as their IUU import rules. Those are particularly important. And we're exploring kind of full suites of labeling standards and other components within GS1 and other organizations, as well as leveraging some open source tools or more open standards basis like universally unique IDs and how to utilize URLs themselves for creating global uniqueness in supply chains.
So how did you end up in seafood traceability?
I used to work for a seafood company prior to doing this work, and my task when I came on board was to digitize and automate our one-up, one-down traceability with our suppliers so that we could report on the sustainability status of our products and have confidence in the IUU freeness of our products. What I wished after I was done is that the global dialogue on seafood traceability existed. And so when I was hearing about its formation, I was desperate to get involved and help try to move the seafood industry forward together.
How does the consumer benefit by this? Is there a way that they can tell if something has been registered through the blockchain or through any other methods?
Yeah, it's there's kind of an indirect answer to that. So the first thing is we're not mandating a level of transparency to consumers through this process. However, as I noted, some of the pressures that are coming onto seafood companies is a desire for greater transparency that they can share with consumers. You'll see going to seafood trade shows that many of the products are advertising QR codes or different trace websites and tools accompanying products to show the provenance. But the challenge is a lot of those have to be built in-house and tailor-suited explicitly for the consumer transparency piece. Really what this potentially enables is that as companies comply across their products, there's greater data availabilities and in a more systematic way so that if they choose to have transparency about their product range entirely, or any other company that hasn't been able to make that same investment or just hasn't, they can now make that choice, and potentially consumers can demand and expect more from more and more seafood companies.
Hey, Neil. Hey, thanks for your talk. So when you think about, adopting a global standard, do you think that's more challenging in your experience upstream or downstream?
So it's certainly more challenging upstream than downstream. So what we've seen from some existing standards, there's a lot more of those companies that are more technically inclined or resource inclined to be able to jump in and utilize standards. But what we've seen, I think, at the same time is that the upstream suppliers closer and closer to harvest are desperately in need of that coherence. I remember one story from one of our members a while back talking about they were being asked from a customer about where was this fish caught. And so they reported the local provincial area of where this fishing vessel was licensed, and they shared that forward. So the customer comes back and is like, that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know where that is, sort of thing. That's in a different language, even if they transliterated it into English or whatever. And so this member responded, and they sent the FAO major fishing area, which these are large swaths of the ocean as identified by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And the customer was like, okay, I get what you're saying, but that's too large of an ocean. I need to know specifically where this was caught. And so inherently, the lack of kind of consistency or clear expectations on the granularity needed is really pushing on the upstream players as well. So while it may be more challenging for the upstream players to jump in with standards, I think inherently they are going to see the biggest yield from consistency in the marketplace.
Any additional questions? So I was going to say one of the challenges we saw in the downstream area in touring some retailers is all the little flags of, certified by XYZ or where the seafood came from at retail in the store. I took a picture of some of that and went to their supplier, and we're doing a pilot with them, showed them the pictures, and they're like, oh, those are all wrong. So retailers are challenged to match up. There's all this great consumer information. You have this fresh seafood out on the counter, but, getting that information paired up, it's challenging. So it's challenging at the retailer as well as upstream, So we've seen a need from the retailer side to have that data accuracy flow all the way to the point of sale. So it's a really important aspect of traceability.
Yeah, no, to add to that, I've seen cases where, they'll make it all the way to the seafood counter and that they print the UPC, for the counters, and the traceability breaks down right there because they hit the wrong, they hit rainbow trout instead of some other species or something. So, yeah, there's some kind of key points that can break along the way. So getting it all the way and figuring that out both upstream and downstream, I think is pretty critical.
Yeah, it's a shame to do all that work of having traceability, then it gets to the retail counter and, they got the flag swapped. So, yeah, it's no good.
So that your question brings up a good point. So is there any type of tagging that they do on these fish, like RFID or anything that you can put on from the catch point to the retail point?
Yeah, I mean, so, we have one problem with seafood. It can be wet and slimy, and tags and things don't like to affix to them pretty well. But there's a pretty well-established practice within the seafood industry of using totes or bins, basically containers, to put the variety of seafood products in them as they're being unloaded from fishing vessels or from the catch, and use unique identification within plants, at least, to identify those products. And so we're looking at how can RFID be used in those circumstances where there are existing standards and guidance on how that can be done. How can QR codes and other barcoding schemes be applied in those circumstances, and to really make that possible, and make sure that what is going on in practice in a paper-based record system can just be demonstrated in a data layer that can be shared across the supply chain. And so you can create those nice physical digital linkages, so you're not claiming something else inadvertently when clearly it has a rich history of information with what's actually there. Yep.
All right. Thanks a lot, Neil.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. So, and thank you for everyone who's attended Traceability Central over the last 3 days. So again, if you have time, visit the kiosk area. We have tremendous traceability solution providers over there, and stop by our main desk so you can learn about our online courses and other offerings at the Global Food Traceability Center. Thank you.